John Martinez, a 34-year-old warehouse supervisor and single father to 10-year-old Sofia, thought his biggest worry was making sure his daughter had everything she needed on his modest income. Then Harold Pemberton knocked on their door at exactly 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday evening, demanding $10,000 for a small terracotta flower pot that Sofia had painted bright yellow and placed on their front porch. What happened next will make you question everything you know about your own neighborhood. Before you hear this story, ask yourself, do you really know your HOA rules? This happened just 8 months ago. The family involved, they're still living there. This story will change how you look at every HOA letter in your mailbox. John had inherited the modest 2-bedroom house in Maple Ridge community from his brother David, who died in a car accident 3 years earlier. It wasn't much, 1,200 square feet, built in 1987, with outdated appliances and carpet that had seen better days, but it was theirs. After years of cramped apartments and the uncertainty that came with renting, Sofia finally had her own bedroom with windows that faced the morning sun. She had planted marigolds in the small strip of earth beside their front steps, tending them each evening with the devotion only a child can bring to something truly their own. The flower pot in question sat on the porch railing, filled with herbs Sofia was growing for a school project about nutrition. Basil, oregano, and a small tomato plant stretched toward the afternoon light. She had painted the plain terracotta pot during art class, covering it with sunflowers and her name in careful 10-year-old cursive. It measured 8 inches across and brought her joy every single morning as she left for school. John worked double shifts at Henderson Logistics, a warehouse 45 minutes from home. His alarm went off at 4:30 a.m. so he could be at work by 6, moving freight and managing inventory until 3 p.m. most days, sometimes later during busy seasons. The drive home through traffic gave him time to mentally transition from supervisor mode to dad mode, planning dinner and homework time and whatever small adventure Sofia had dreamed up for their evening together. Money was always tight. His brother's medical bills had eaten through most of the life insurance, and the house still carried a mortgage, but they were making it work. Sofia was thriving at Lincoln Elementary, her grades were solid, and she had friends in the neighborhood. That felt like victory enough. The HOA had never been an issue. John paid the monthly fee of $127 automatically, through his bank account, the same way he handled all his bills. He kept their small front yard neat, took in the trash cans promptly, and made sure Sofia's bike was stored in the garage overnight. The community seemed peaceful, young families mixed with retirees, most people nodding hello. During evening walks, children playing in the shared green space behind the elementary school. John appreciated the sense of order and safety it provided for Sofia. She could ride her bike to her friend Emma's house 3 streets over without him worrying about traffic or strangers. Harold Pemberton had been HOA president for 6 years, a position he'd campaigned for aggressively after his early retirement from a regional insurance company. Neighbors remembered his door-to-door visits, promising accountability and proper standards for their community. At 62, Harold maintained the rigid posture of someone accustomed to authority, his gray hair always precisely combed, and his polo shirts pressed with military precision. He drove a black BMW sedan that he washed every Sunday morning, and his own lawn looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. His house was the largest in the community, a colonial style with white columns and carefully manicured landscaping that must have cost more than John's annual salary. The knock that evening came just as John was helping Sofia with her math homework at the kitchen table. She was working through fractions, her tongue poking out in concentration, when the sharp rap on the front door made them both look up. John wasn't expecting anyone. Sofia's friend Emma had gone home an hour earlier, and Mrs. Garcia next door usually called before coming over. Through the peephole, John saw Harold's severe expression and felt his stomach tighten. With the automatic anxiety that comes with unexpected authority figures at your door, Harold stood on the small concrete porch holding a manila folder and wearing the expression of someone delivering very serious news. Behind him, parked in John's driveway, sat Harold's immaculate BMW with the engine still running. The message was clear: this wouldn't take long, but it would be definitive. The citation Harold handed John was printed on official HOA letterhead, complete with the community logo and Harold's title in bold letters. The violation was listed as unauthorized outdoor decoration in direct violation of Community Standards Section 72A. The fine was $10,000, due within 30 days, with an additional $500 in administrative fees. Late payment would result in a lien being placed against the property. John read the document twice, his hands actually shaking as the numbers registered. $10,000 for Sofia's flower pot. The same amount of money he'd spent on his used Honda Civic. More than he'd ever had in his savings account at one time. His first thought was that there had to be some mistake. Surely Harold meant $100, or maybe even $1,000 as some kind of extreme penalty. But the document was clear, typed in official language that left no room for interpretation. Harold explained with a patient tone of someone accustomed to dealing with rule breakers that outdoor decorations required prior written approval from the HOA board, a process outlined in the community guidelines that every homeowner received upon purchase. John tried to explain that Sofia had made the pot at school, that it contained herbs for an educational project, that they'd been living there for 3 years without any complaints about anything. Harold's response was immediate and non-negotiable. Ignorance of the rules wasn't an excuse, the violation was clear, and the fine structure was designed to ensure compliance moving forward. Standing in his doorway, holding a piece of paper that could destroy his family's financial stability, John felt the ground shift beneath him in a way it hadn't since David's death. This was their home, their safe place, the foundation everything else was built on. Sofia was still at the kitchen table, waiting for help with her homework, trusting completely that her father would handle whatever adult business was happening at the front door. The weight of that trust, combined with the impossibility of the situation, made it hard for John to find his voice. That night, after Sofia was asleep, John spread all of his HOA documents across the kitchen table. The original purchase paperwork, the monthly payment receipts, every communication he'd ever received from the board, which amounted to exactly 3 pieces of mail over 3 years. The first was a welcome letter when they'd moved in. The second was a reminder about trash can placement. And the third was this citation. He read through the community guidelines David had received at closing, a 40-page document written in dense legal language. That covered everything from acceptable paint colors to the precise height grass could reach before requiring cutting. Section 7.2a did indeed prohibit unauthorized outdoor decorations, but the examples given included things like yard art, seasonal displays, and recreational equipment. The language was vague enough that it could potentially apply to flower pots, but the spirit of the rule seemed aimed at preventing the kind of tacky displays that might lower property values. More concerning was the fine structure, which escalated dramatically based on the severity and impact of violations, with the HOA board having complete discretion over assessment amounts. John had never paid close attention to neighborhood politics, but he started making mental notes during his evening walks with Sofia over the next few days. 3 houses had seasonal wreaths on their doors that had been up since Christmas. It was now March. 2 houses had small garden flags displaying team logos. Mrs. Patterson's house had a decorative bird bath in the front yard that had been there since John moved in. The Williams family had installed solar lights along their walkway, without any apparent HOA approval process. None of these homes showed any signs of citations or violations. The disparity was troubling, but John's immediate problem was coming up with $10,000 in 3 weeks. He called the HOA office number listed on the citation and reached a voicemail system that directed all violation-related inquiries to be submitted in writing. He wrote a careful letter explaining the situation, requesting a hearing or some kind of appeals process, and proposing a payment plan if the fine couldn't be reduced. He hand-delivered the letter to Harold's house on Saturday morning, finding Harold washing his BMW in the driveway. Harold accepted the letter with the same patient expression he'd worn while issuing the citation, promising to forward it to the appropriate board members for review. His response would come through official channels within the required time frame. In the meantime, Harold suggested John familiarize himself more thoroughly with the community standards to avoid future violations. The entire interaction lasted less than 3 minutes, but it left John with the distinct impression that his letter would have no effect whatsoever on the outcome. The certified mail response arrived 6 days later. The HOA board had reviewed John's request and determined that the violation was clear and the fine was appropriate to the severity of the infraction. No payment plan would be considered, as the community standards required prompt compliance with all citations to maintain the integrity of the enforcement process. The letter was signed by all 3 board members, Harold Pemberton as president, Brenda Collins as vice president, and Leonard Watson as treasurer. It was dated the same day John had delivered his appeal letter, which meant they'd made their decision before any meaningful review could have taken place. John had 18 days left to find $10,000 or face a lien against his home. He worked overtime every shift Henderson would give him, but warehouse work only paid so much, even with premium rates. He looked into personal loans and found that his credit was decent, but not good enough for an unsecured loan of that size. Taking out a second mortgage was theoretically possible, but the paperwork would take months. And the additional monthly payment would stretch his budget to the breaking point. He considered asking his ex-wife Maria for help, but their relationship had ended badly 3 years earlier, and she was barely managing her own expenses as a teacher in another state. The stress was affecting his sleep and his ability to focus at work. Sofia noticed the change immediately, the way children always do when their parents' anxiety seeps into the household atmosphere. She asked careful questions about whether they were okay, whether they had enough money, whether they'd have to move like they had before finding this house. John reassured her with the confidence every parent learns to project while their world is falling apart, but he could see she wasn't entirely convinced. Her school project about nutrition had evolved into genuine enthusiasm for gardening, and she'd started researching companion planting and composting with the intensity she usually reserved for her favorite video games. The idea that her herb garden might be the thing that cost them their home was almost more than John could bear. 2 weeks before the payment deadline, John was approached by Mrs. Chen, an elderly neighbor who lived 4 houses down. Margaret Chen was 73 years old, a retired accountant who had moved to Maple Ridge after her husband died 5 years earlier. She kept to herself mostly, but John had helped her carry groceries a few times, and Sofia always waved when Mrs. Chen was working in her own immaculate garden. Mrs. Chen asked if they could speak privately, and something in her manner suggested this wasn't a casual conversation. They met on Sunday morning while Sofia was at her friend Emma's house, sitting at Mrs. Chen's kitchen table over coffee that was stronger than anything John usually drank. Mrs. Chen had been watching the situation with Harold and the HOA, and she had information that John needed to hear. She'd served on the HOA board herself for 2 years before Harold's election, and she'd remained friendly with Leonard Watson, the treasurer, who'd grown increasingly uncomfortable with Harold's enforcement policies over the past year. The $10,000 fine wasn't random or based solely on community standards. Harold had been systematically targeting single-parent households and elderly residents with escalating violations and excessive fines, using his position to generate revenue that went far beyond the community's actual maintenance needs. The HOA account had grown from $30,000 to over $200,000 during Harold's tenure, with most of the increase coming from violation penalties rather than monthly assessments. Leonard had tried to raise questions about the aggressive enforcement, but Harold dominated board meetings and had gradually pushed out anyone who challenged his methods. Mrs. Chen had documented everything. She kept meticulous records of every violation notice issued, every fine assessed, and every payment collected over the past 2 years. The pattern was clear. Families with limited financial resources received the harshest penalties for the most minor infractions, while well-connected residents seemed immune from enforcement altogether. The Hendersons had installed a hot tub without HOA approval and received a $50 fine. The Pattersons had painted their front door a non-approved color and were given 30 days to correct it at no charge. But Mrs. Rodriguez, a single mother working 2 jobs, had been fined $1,500 for children's toys being visible in her front yard overnight. The documentation was overwhelming, but Mrs. Chen had something even more disturbing to share. Harold had been conducting unauthorized surveillance of targeted properties, taking photographs of alleged violations from public areas and even hiring a private investigator to document infractions that weren't visible from the street. The private investigator had been providing reports on residents' work schedules, family situations, and financial status information Harold was using to determine who could afford significant fines and who was likely to simply move away rather than fight back. John felt sick as the scope of the situation became clear. This wasn't about community standards or property values. It was systematic financial harassment designed to benefit Harold and his inner circle while driving out residents who couldn't afford to fight back. The flower pot was just an excuse, a pretext for extracting money from a single father who Harold assumed would either pay quietly or leave. The $10,000 amount was calculated to be devastating but not quite enough to justify hiring a lawyer. Mrs. Chen had more evidence than just financial records. She'd been secretly photographing Harold's surveillance activities and had recordings, of conversations between Harold and Brenda Collins about targeting specific residents. The recordings revealed their strategy: identify vulnerable residents, document minor violations that could be interpreted broadly, assess fines high enough to cause real financial distress, then offer payment plans that kept residents trapped in an ongoing cycle of payments and compliance. Residents who fought back found themselves facing additional violations and escalating harassment until they either paid or moved away. The private investigator Harold hired was Robert Bobby Hutchins, a former security guard, who'd been fired from his previous job for unauthorized surveillance activities. Bobby had been conducting drive-bys of targeted properties during school hours and work schedules, taking photographs of anything that could potentially be considered a violation. He'd been hired to specifically document John's property after Harold identified him as a target, and the timing of the flower pot citation wasn't coincidental. It came just days after Bobby had submitted a report detailing John's work schedule and financial situation. Mrs. Chen had photographs of Bobby's vehicle parked across from John's house on multiple occasions, along with documentation of similar surveillance at other targeted properties. She'd also recorded Harold bragging to Brenda about their success in collecting over $60,000 in violation fines from just 7 families over the past 18 months. Most of the families had eventually moved away, unable to afford the ongoing harassment or the escalating fines for additional manufactured violations. The evidence was compelling, but Mrs. Chen warned John that Harold wasn't operating alone. Brenda Collins was a full participant in the scheme, using her position as vice president to provide legitimacy to the violation process. Leonard Watson, the treasurer, had been gradually marginalized but hadn't found the courage to speak out directly. The 3 board members had created an insular system that protected each other while systematically exploiting their neighbors. John spent the rest of that Sunday afternoon processing what Mrs. Chen had told him. The violation against his family wasn't an isolated incident or an overly strict interpretation of community rules. It was criminal behavior disguised as HOA enforcement. Harold was essentially running a protection racket, using his elected position to extort money from residents who had trusted him to maintain their community's standards. The betrayal felt personal and profound, like discovering that someone you'd trusted with your family's safety had been planning to hurt them all along. That evening, while Sofia worked on her science homework, John began documenting everything he could remember about Harold's behavior and the HOA's enforcement patterns. He wrote down every interaction he'd had with Harold, every detail he could recall about the citation process, and every observation he'd made about inconsistent enforcement around the neighborhood. He photographed Sofia's flower pot from every angle, documenting that it was a simple educational project that posed no conceivable threat to community standards or property values. The next morning, John called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years and drove to the county courthouse to research HOA regulations and homeowner rights. He spent 6 hours reading through property law, HOA governance requirements, and consumer protection statutes. What he learned was both encouraging and frustrating. Harold's behavior was clearly illegal, but proving it would require extensive documentation and potentially expensive legal action. HOAs were granted significant authority over community enforcement, but that authority had limits, and Harold had exceeded those limits dramatically. John also discovered that HOA boards were required to follow specific procedures for violation notices and appeals, procedures that Harold had completely ignored. Fines over a certain threshold required formal hearings with written documentation and opportunities for residents to present their defense. The board was required to maintain detailed records of all enforcement actions and make those records available to residents upon request. Harold had violated multiple state regulations governing HOA operations, violations that could result in personal liability for board members and potential criminal charges for fraud and extortion. Armed with this information, John wrote a formal request for all documentation related to his violation, including the original complaint, any photographs or evidence of the infraction, records of similar violations in the community, and detailed justification for the fine amount. He hand-delivered the request to Harold's house that evening, finding Harold in his garage, organizing tools with the same precision he brought to everything else in his life. Harold's reaction to the document request was immediate and telling. His composed demeanor cracked slightly as he read through John's carefully worded legal language, and his response was defensive rather than professional. Harold claimed that the board wasn't required to provide such detailed documentation for routine violations. and he suggested that John was overcomplicating what should be a simple compliance matter. The fine was reasonable, the violation was clear, and continued challenges to the board's authority would only result in additional scrutiny of John's property for other potential violations. The threat was unsubtle and deeply concerning. Harold was essentially promising retaliation if John continued to challenge the citation, a promise that revealed the corrupt nature of his enforcement system. Legitimate HOA boards welcomed questions and provided transparency. Criminal operations relied on intimidation and secrecy. John left the conversation knowing that Harold would escalate the harassment, but also knowing that he had no choice but to fight back. Sofia's security and their family's future depended on exposing what Harold was doing. The escalation began 3 days later with a second citation, this one for improper storage of recreational equipment, because Sofia's bicycle was visible in their garage. The garage door had been open while John was taking out the trash, and someone had photographed the bicycle's position near the door opening. The fine was $3,000, with a note that repeated violations would result in accelerated enforcement procedures and potential legal action to remove non-compliant residents from the community. John had been expecting retaliation, but the brazenness of this second citation was startling. Harold wasn't even pretending that his enforcement was about community standards. He was demonstrating his power to generate violations whenever he chose and extract money through intimidation. The timing was also calculated. With the original fine due in less than a week, John was now facing $13,000 in total penalties, an amount that would definitely require him to sell the house or face foreclosure. That evening, Mrs. Chen called John with urgent news. Leonard Watson had finally decided to speak out, and he wanted to meet privately to share information about Harold's activities that even Mrs. Chen didn't know about. Leonard had been documenting Harold's behavior for months, waiting for the right moment to act, and John's resistance had given him the courage to step forward. They agreed to meet at a restaurant across town, away from the neighborhood, where Harold's surveillance network might detect their conversation. Leonard Watson was 64 years old, a retired banker who'd moved to Maple Ridge for the quiet retirement community atmosphere Harold had promised during his campaign for HOA president. Leonard had initially supported Harold's emphasis on maintaining property values and community standards, but he did gradually realize that Harold's definition of standards had nothing to do with genuine community improvement. Leonard had been keeping detailed financial records that revealed the true scope of Harold's operation. The HOA account contained over $215,000, nearly 7 times the amount needed for actual community maintenance and improvements. The excess money was sitting in interest-bearing accounts controlled solely by Harold, who'd gradually pushed Leonard out of day-to-day financial oversight while maintaining him as treasurer for appearance purposes. Harold had been using HOA funds for personal expenses, including payments to Bobby Hutchins for surveillance activities that weren't authorized by the board and had no legitimate community purpose. Leonard had discovered that Harold was also manipulating maintenance contracts to generate kickbacks from service providers. The lawn care company paid Harold a monthly fee for the exclusive contract to service Maple Ridge, despite providing substandard work at inflated prices. The same arrangement existed with the snow removal service, the pool maintenance company, and the parking lot striping contractor. Harold was generating thousands of dollars in personal income through his HOA position, while simultaneously extorting residents through manufactured violations. The financial records Leonard provided painted a picture of systematic corruption that went far beyond aggressive enforcement. Harold was essentially stealing from every resident in the community, while using his position to terrorize the most vulnerable families. The money residents paid in monthly assessments and violation fines was being diverted to Harold's personal benefit while community maintenance suffered. The pool filtration system needed repairs that Harold kept deferring. The playground equipment was developing safety issues that weren't being addressed, and the walking paths were deteriorating because maintenance money was being stolen for Harold's profit. Leonard had been afraid to speak out because Harold had threatened him with personal retaliation, including potential criminal charges for financial mismanagement if Leonard tried to expose the corruption. Harold had convinced Leonard that they were both legally liable for the financial irregularities, and that Leonard's cooperation in maintaining silence was the only way to avoid prosecution. Leonard had believed Harold's threats until he realized that Harold's increasing desperation was making the situation more dangerous for everyone involved. John now had overwhelming evidence of criminal behavior, but he also had a family to protect and limited resources for fighting back. Harold's willingness to escalate enforcement against anyone who challenged him meant that continued resistance would likely result in additional harassment and potentially dangerous retaliation, but paying the fines would validate Harold's system and enable him to continue victimizing other families. John was trapped between protecting his own family and protecting his community from a predator who was stealing from everyone while terrorizing the most vulnerable residents. That weekend, John made a decision that would change everything. Instead of trying to fight Harold privately through official channels that Harold controlled, John would expose the entire operation publicly and let the community decide how to respond. He spent Saturday afternoon walking through the neighborhood, documenting every property that had visible violations that weren't being enforced. He photographed seasonal decorations, unauthorized modifications, maintenance issues that were being ignored, and landscaping that violated the same standards being used to target him and other vulnerable residents. The documentation revealed a clear pattern of selective enforcement that couldn't be explained by any legitimate interpretation of community standards. Harold and his allies were immune from violations while single parents, elderly residents and families with limited financial resources faced escalating harassment for identical or more minor infractions. John had photographs of Harold's own property showing maintenance issues that exceeded anything Harold was citing other residents for, including paint damage, landscaping violations, and unauthorized modifications that would have resulted in massive fines if discovered at any other property. John spent Sunday afternoon creating a comprehensive presentation that documented Harold's corruption, including Mrs. Chen's financial records, Leonard's treasury documentation, his own research into HOA law violations, and photographic evidence of selective enforcement. He included detailed breakdowns of the excessive fines assessed against vulnerable residents compared to the minimal penalties assessed against Harold's supporters. The presentation clearly showed that Harold was running a criminal enterprise disguised as community management. Monday morning, John took his documentation to Detective Rivera at the county sheriff's office, requesting investigation into fraud, extortion, and violation of HOA governance regulations. Detective Rivera was a 15-year veteran who'd handled numerous cases involving HOA disputes, and she immediately recognized the patterns of criminal behavior in John's documentation. She'd seen similar cases where elected HOA officials used their positions for personal enrichment while harassing residents who couldn't afford to fight back. Detective Rivera explained that HOA corruption cases were particularly challenging because they involved abuse of authority that residents were conditioned to accept as legitimate. Many victims never realized that their treatment was criminal rather than simply unfair, and those who did recognize the criminal behavior often lacked the resources to fight back effectively. The key to successful prosecution was building a comprehensive case with multiple victims willing to testify, and documented evidence of financial crimes that couldn't be dismissed as simple policy disputes. John's documentation provided an excellent foundation for investigation, but Detective Rivera warned him that Harold would likely escalate his harassment once he realized that criminal investigation was underway. HOA corruption cases often involved sophisticated schemes to intimidate witnesses and victims, including manufactured violations designed to force families out of the community before they could testify. John needed to be prepared for significant retaliation while the investigation proceeded. The retaliation began Tuesday morning with a third citation, this one for unauthorized modification of exterior property appearance because John had installed a small security camera near his front door. The camera had been installed the previous weekend specifically to document any harassment or surveillance activities directed at his property. Harold's citation claimed that security cameras required pre-approval from the HOA board and that John's camera violated privacy standards for neighboring properties. The fine was $5,000, bringing John's total penalties to $18,000. With payment now overdue and subject to additional late fees. The timing and content of this third citation confirmed that Harold was monitoring John's activities and retaliating specifically for his decision to fight back. Installing security cameras was a reasonable response to documented harassment, but Harold was treating it as a violation while simultaneously using unauthorized surveillance against targeted residents. The hypocrisy was blatant. But Harold's control over the enforcement process meant that he could manufacture violations with impunity as long as residents were afraid to challenge his authority collectively. John realized that Harold's power depended entirely on isolating his victims and preventing them from organizing effective resistance. Individual residents could be overwhelmed with manufactured violations and excessive fines, but a coordinated community response would expose Harold's criminal behavior and potentially result in criminal prosecution. John needed to find other victims who were willing to speak out and provide testimony that would support Detective Rivera's investigation. Mrs. Rodriguez was the first victim John contacted directly. Carmen Rodriguez was a 38-year-old nurse who worked night shifts at the county hospital while raising 2 children as a single mother. Harold had been targeting her family for 8 months, beginning with citations for toys being visible in their front yard, and escalating to fines for everything from the color of her window shades to the timing of her trash can placement. Carmen had paid over $4,000 in violation fines while being subjected to constant harassment and surveillance that made her children afraid to play in their own yard. Carmen's story revealed the psychological impact of Harold's harassment on families with children. Her 7-year-old son had developed anxiety about being outside their house because Harold or Bobby Hutchins drove by their property multiple times each day, taking photographs and making notes. Her 10-year-old daughter had stopped inviting friends over because Harold had cited them for excessive pedestrian traffic when children were walking to their house. Carmen was exhausted from working full-time night shifts while dealing with constant HOA harassment, and she'd been considering moving away despite loving their neighborhood and community. The psychological terrorism aspect of Harold's operation was something John hadn't fully appreciated until hearing Carmen's experience. Harold wasn't just extracting money through manufactured violations. He was systematically destroying families' sense of security and belonging in their own homes. Children were learning that their normal activities could result in financial penalties and harassment. Parents were afraid to allow natural family life because any visible sign of normal childhood could become evidence for violation citations. Carmen had documentation of her own that supported John's case. Harold had demanded access to her property for compliance inspections that went far beyond any legitimate HOA authority. He'd photographed the interior of her garage while claiming to investigate unauthorized storage, and he'd questioned her children about their activities and schedules while she was at work. Carmen had recorded several of these interactions, and the recordings revealed Harold's predatory behavior and his deliberate targeting of a working single mother who couldn't afford legal representation. John found similar patterns with other victims throughout the community. Mrs. Patterson, an 82-year-old widow, had been cited for failure to maintain approved landscaping standards because she couldn't afford professional lawn care on her fixed income. The Johnsons, a young couple with a disabled child, had been fined repeatedly for medical equipment being visible through their windows. The Williamses, a retired black couple, had been subjected to harassment that included racial undertones and citations for cultural decorations that reflected their heritage. Each victim had been isolated and intimidated into believing that their treatment was somehow legitimate or that they were uniquely targeted for enforcement. Harold's strategy depended on preventing victims from communicating with each other and recognizing the systematic nature of his criminal behavior. Once John began connecting victims and sharing their experiences, the pattern of deliberate targeting became undeniable and the community impact became clear. Detective Rivera scheduled individual interviews with each victim John identified, and the testimony revealed additional criminal behavior that even John hadn't discovered. Harold had been using his access to HOA records to gather personal information about residents, including financial data, employment information, and family details that he used to identify vulnerable targets. He'd been sharing this information with Bobby Hutchins and using it to develop harassment strategies tailored to each family's specific vulnerabilities. The investigation also revealed that Harold had been threatening elderly residents with eviction procedures that had no legal basis, exploiting their limited understanding of HOA authority to extract compliance and payments for manufactured violations. Several elderly residents had paid thousands of dollars in fines rather than risk losing their homes, even though Harold had no authority to force them to move. The financial exploitation of elderly residents elevated Harold's crimes to felony level and triggered additional consumer protection violations. Harold became aware of the criminal investigation when Detective Rivera served him with a warrant to examine HOA financial records and documentation of all violation procedures over the past 2 years. Harold's response was immediate and desperate. He accelerated harassment against John and other identified victims while attempting to destroy evidence and intimidate potential witnesses. The morning after the warrant was served, John found his car's tires slashed, and a threatening note warning him to withdraw his complaints or face serious consequences. The intimidation tactics revealed Harold's desperation but also provided additional evidence of criminal behavior. Threatening witnesses in a criminal investigation was a separate felony, and the escalation from financial crimes to physical harassment demonstrated Harold's dangerous instability as his scheme collapsed. Detective Rivera arranged increased patrol coverage for victim families and advised them to document any suspicious activities or harassment attempts. Sofia became aware that something serious was happening when John installed additional security cameras and changed their evening routine to avoid predictable patterns that might make them vulnerable to Harold's retaliation. John explained the situation in terms a 10-year-old could understand. A neighborhood official had been breaking rules and hurting families, and they were helping police make sure he couldn't hurt anyone else. Sofia's response surprised John with its maturity and moral clarity. She understood that protecting other children was worth the temporary disruption to their own security. The criminal investigation accelerated when Leonard Watson provided Detective Rivera with complete financial records showing over $200,000 in improper expenditures and revenue generation through manufactured violations. Leonard also provided recorded conversations where Harold explicitly described his targeting strategies and bragged about the money he was extracting from stupid residents who don't know their rights. The recordings provided clear evidence of criminal intent and systematic fraud that would be difficult for Harold to explain as legitimate HOA enforcement. Harold's attempts to destroy evidence backfired when he tried to manipulate HOA financial records to cover his tracks. Leonard had maintained backup copies of all documentation, and Harold's clumsy attempts to alter official records provided additional evidence of obstruction of justice and tampering with evidence. Detective Rivera's investigation had evolved from HOA corruption into a comprehensive criminal case involving fraud, extortion, witness intimidation, and evidence tampering. The community became aware of the investigation when Detective Rivera conducted a neighborhood canvass, interviewing residents about their experiences with HOA enforcement and Harold's behavior. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of residents came forward with stories of harassment, excessive fines, and intimidation tactics they'd endured while believing they were isolated victims. Many residents had been afraid to speak out individually, but the criminal investigation provided them with protection and validation for their experiences. Mrs. Chen organized community meetings where residents could share their experiences and coordinate their testimony for the criminal case. The meetings revealed the true scope of Harold's impact on their neighborhood. Families had moved away rather than fight harassment. Elderly residents had depleted their savings paying manufactured fines, and children had developed anxiety disorders from constant surveillance and intimidation. The psychological and financial damage extended far beyond the individual victims John had initially identified. The community meetings also revealed Harold's network of enablers and supporters who had benefited from his corrupt system. Brenda Collins had received kickbacks from service contractors and had actively participated in harassment campaigns against targeted families. 3 other residents had received favorable treatment in exchange for providing information about their neighbors' activities and schedules to Harold's surveillance operation. The corruption had infected multiple layers of community leadership and social relationships. Harold's desperation intensified as more victims came forward and the criminal case strengthened. He attempted to rally his remaining supporters by claiming that the investigation was orchestrated by residents who wanted to destroy community standards and property values. He sent letters to every homeowner claiming that John and other troublemakers were trying to eliminate HOA authority entirely and turn their neighborhood into an unregulated slum. The letters were filled with racial and economic coded language designed to frighten residents about changing community demographics. The fear-mongering campaign backfired when residents compared Harold's letters with the documented evidence of his criminal behavior. Many residents who had initially supported Harold's strict enforcement realized they had been manipulated into enabling financial crimes against their neighbors. The revelation that their monthly assessments had been stolen while community maintenance was neglected turned even Harold's supporters against him. Detective Rivera's investigation culminated when she obtained a search warrant for Harold's personal residence and discovered over $60,000 in cash, detailed surveillance files on targeted residents, and correspondence with Bobby Hutchins outlining plans to force specific families out of the neighborhood. The evidence included photographs of children playing, work schedules for single parents, and financial assessments of residents' ability to pay escalating fines. The level of predatory surveillance shocked even experienced investigators familiar with HOA corruption cases. The search also revealed Harold's plans to expand his operation to other communities where he'd been seeking HOA board positions. Harold had developed a systematic approach to gaining control of HOA boards, identifying vulnerable communities with high concentrations of elderly residents and single-parent families who could be targeted for financial exploitation. He'd created detailed playbooks for manufactured violations and harassment, campaigns that he planned to implement across multiple neighborhoods. Harold was arrested on 17 felony counts including fraud, extortion, witness, intimidation, evidence tampering, and violation of consumer protection laws. Brenda Collins was charged with conspiracy and fraud. Bobby Hutchins faced charges for illegal surveillance and intimidation. The arrests made regional news as an example of HOA corruption that had escalated to criminal enterprise levels rarely seen in residential community cases. John attended Harold's initial court hearing with Sofia, who had asked to see the man who'd tried to take away their home. Harold appeared diminished and confused, his rigid posture replaced by the hunched shoulders of someone whose carefully constructed authority had collapsed completely. The judge set bail at $200,000 and ordered Harold to have no contact with Maple Ridge residents and no involvement with any HOA activities pending trial. The legal resolution brought immediate relief to Harold's victims, but the community healing process took longer to unfold. Residents needed time to process the extent to which they'd been manipulated and exploited by someone they'd trusted with authority over their homes and families. Many families struggled with guilt about not recognizing Harold's criminal behavior earlier or not speaking out when they witnessed harassment of their neighbors. John found himself in an unexpected leadership role as residents looked to him for guidance on rebuilding their HOA system and community trust. He worked with Mrs. Chen and Leonard Watson to establish new board procedures that included transparency requirements, financial oversight mechanisms, and resident protections against harassment and excessive enforcement. The new system required multiple board member approval for any fine over $100 and created an independent appeals process for all violations. The community voted to reduce their monthly assessments by 40% once they realized how much money Harold had been stealing for unnecessary expenses and personal profit. The excess money in the HOA account was returned to residents as credits against future assessments, with additional compensation provided to victims who had paid excessive fines. John's family received full reimbursement for their $18,000 in manufactured fines plus interest and compensation for harassment damages. Sofia's herb garden became a symbol of the community's recovery and renewal. Other families began planting gardens and flower pots as expressions of their freedom from Harold's intimidation and control. The neighborhood developed a more relaxed and family-friendly atmosphere as residents realized they could enjoy their properties without fear of arbitrary punishment for normal family activities. John was elected to the new HOA board, along with Mrs. Chen, and 2 other residents who had opposed Harold's corruption. Their first official action was to formally apologize to all victims of Harold's harassment and to establish a community fund to help families who had suffered financial hardship from manufactured fines. They also created new policies that prioritized community building and family-friendly activities over rigid enforcement of minor aesthetic standards. The criminal trial lasted 3 months and resulted in Harold being sentenced to 6 years in federal prison for mail fraud, extortion, and racketeering. Brenda Collins received 2 years for conspiracy and fraud. Bobby Hutchins was sentenced to 1 year for illegal surveillance and intimidation. The judge ordered full restitution to victims and additional fines that exceeded the amount Harold had stolen from the community. Detective Rivera used the case as a model for training other investigators in HOA corruption patterns and investigation techniques. John's documentation methods and Mrs. Chen's record-keeping became templates for residents in other communities who suspected similar criminal behavior from their HOA boards. The case generated new legislation requiring additional oversight and transparency for HOA operations throughout the state. John's experience transformed his understanding of civic responsibility and community leadership. He realized that protecting his family required protecting all families in his community, and that individual safety depended on collective vigilance against abuse of authority. He began speaking at other communities about recognizing and responding to HOA corruption, helping other families avoid the harassment his family had endured. Sofia's school project about nutrition evolved into a community garden project. That brought neighbors together for shared activities and mutual support. She learned that standing up for what's right sometimes requires courage and sacrifice, but that communities become stronger when people protect each other from bullies and predators. Her herb garden flourished in its bright yellow pot, now joined by dozens of other colorful containers as symbols of freedom and community resilience. The Maple Ridge community developed new traditions focused on family activities and neighborhood connection rather than rigid rule enforcement. Summer barbecues replaced violation hearings. Community garden workshops replaced surveillance reports. And children's laughter replaced the anxiety that had characterized Harold's reign of terror. Property values actually increased as the neighborhood became known for its welcoming atmosphere and strong community bonds. John's relationship with Sofia deepened through their shared experience of standing up to injustice and protecting their home. She understood that her father had fought not just for their family but for every family in their neighborhood who couldn't fight for themselves. The lesson shaped her understanding of responsibility and courage in ways that would influence her choices throughout her life. 3 years later, John still lives in the house his brother left him, but now, it truly feels like home in ways it never did under Harold's intimidation. Sofia, now 13, tends an expanded garden that supplies herbs and vegetables to several neighbors. And she's developing plans to study environmental science and community development in college. The flower pot that started their ordeal still sits on the porch railing, now surrounded by a thriving ecosystem of plants and neighbors who look out for each other. The investigation revealed that Harold had targeted over 40 families during his 6 years as HOA president, extracting more than $300,000 through manufactured violations and harassment campaigns. Many families had moved away rather than fight his system, but those who remained found strength in their shared experience and commitment to ensuring that no community leader could ever again use fear and intimidation to exploit their neighbors' trust. Mrs. Chen continued her role as community historian and watchdog, maintaining detailed records of all HOA activities, and ensuring that transparency and accountability remained central to their neighborhood governance. Leonard Watson became the permanent treasurer with expanded oversight responsibilities and community reporting requirements that made financial manipulation impossible. Detective Rivera's investigation methods were adopted by law enforcement agencies in 12 states, leading to successful prosecution of similar HOA corruption cases across the region. The Maple Ridge case became a landmark example of how community organizing and professional investigation could expose and stop systematic abuse of authority that had previously been hidden behind legitimate-seeming administrative procedures. John's story spread through social media and news coverage, inspiring residents in hundreds of communities to examine their own HOA practices and challenge suspicious enforcement patterns. The phrase, "Remember Maple Ridge," became shorthand for residents' rights advocacy and community organizing against HOA corruption. John received hundreds of messages from families who recognized similar patterns in their own communities and found courage to speak out after hearing about his experience. The most lasting impact of John's fight against Harold's corruption was the transformation of Maple Ridge from a community ruled by fear into a neighborhood governed by mutual respect and shared responsibility. Residents learned that their individual security depended on collective vigilance and that protecting the most vulnerable families strengthened the entire community's resilience against future abuse. Sofia's bright yellow flower pot still catches the morning sun on their front porch, now joined by dozens of other containers as symbols of a community that chose courage over compliance, justice over quiet submission, and family protection over individual safety. The herbs she grows there continue to flourish, nourished by soil that's truly free and